The other thing is bile, to understand. Most of you know about bile really well. One of the things that is really important to note that obviously the liver makes the bile. It secretes it into the gallbladder where it's stored, and then the bile is secreted in the duodenum itself during a meal. Now, bile has many different functions. One of them is to help us absorb fat-soluble vitamins and other fat-soluble nutrients. It also helps to neutralize fat-based toxins and takes it to the liver for decontamination and excretion. But one of its really important functions is it is a strong antimicrobial. Bile is a very powerful antimicrobial, and bile is secreted while we're eating, which is one of the risk factors for having food come in, or one of the risk factors for having bacteria come in, which is through food. And also during food, you get a buffering of the stomach acid, and because of the buffering of the stomach acid, it may allow salivary and other bacteria in your mouth to survive better through to the gastric system. And so bile can act as a secondary check to prevent those bacteria from overgrowing. And 95% of the bile that's released in response to eating a meal gets reabsorbed in the terminal end of the ileum and gets resent through the hepatic portal vein to the liver for cleaning up. And then it's cleaned up and recirculated again. In a single meal, that same bile acid pool can be secreted and recycled 15 times. So your body is designed to keep the small intestine coated with bile during the process of digestion. And think about how important that is, because remember, if we get above 10 to the 4 CFUs or colony forming units per ml of aspirate in the small intestine, we have overgrowth and we have all of those dysfunctions and all of those symptoms, right? Bile is there while food is present, which is when bacteria would metabolize and overgrow very quickly. Bile is there continuously through the process of digestion to maintain an antimicrobial effect. Now, it's also important to note that about 5% of the bile in the small intestine is converted into secondary bile salts and sent into the large intestine, right? This is really interesting when you look at it, because secondary bile salts in large amounts are actually super inflammatory in the large bowel and are associated with dysfunctions in the colonic epithelium itself. But a small amount of secondary bile salts is actually quite important, because one of their functions is actually to inhibit the growth of C. diff. So secondary bile salts, from the 5% of bile that gets reabsorbed, 5% of it gets conjugated into secondary bile salts, is sent into the small intestine to large intestine to prevent the growth of certain pathogens like C. diff. Now, the rest of the bile, as it's passing through the ileum and on its way to return to the liver, triggers something called the FXR receptor. The FXR receptor stimulates the production of antimicrobial compounds by the intestinal epithelial cells, right? So here we have all of these mechanisms in place to prevent bacterial growth during digestion of food. We've got bile by itself. Bile, when it actually mixes with long-chain fatty acids, creates a very potent surfactant in the small intestine, which again then has more antimicrobial activity. And then on top of that, bile stimulates the release of antimicrobial compounds by all of the small intestinal epithelial cells. So you've got all of these mechanisms in place to prevent bacteria from growing while food is present in the small intestine. And bile plays a central role in this. And what we find is that decreasing levels of bile acids in the gut favor gram-negative members of the microbiome, some of which produce potent LPS, which also includes pathogens, right? So there are lots of studies that show as you get a reduction in the bile acid pool, if the amount of bile being secreted during mealtime is inadequate, you start to get a taxa shift and you start to get more growth of gram-negative bacteria, which is exactly what you see in SIBO. You get the taxa shift to gram-negative bacteria. So this is an important protective mechanism. And what are some of the things that really drive bile dysfunction? Obstruction of bile ducts, removal of gallbladders, and of course, liver dysfunction. Any sort of liver dysfunction will reduce the amount of bile that's being produced, reduces the bile acid pool, and reduces the deconjugation of bile in the liver, right? So we get a bile dysfunction. So if that is true, then liver conditions would be associated with SIBO, because bile is so important to prevent SIBO. And sure enough, it absolutely is. So they show, some studies reinforce the concept that small intestinal bacterial overgrowth plays an important role in the pathogenesis of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, much of it through the activation of tumor necrosis factor as a mediator of this condition, right? So we've got a self-perpetuating loop here, which is really interesting as you start digging into it. You get dysfunction in the liver. Dysfunction in the liver leads to reduction in the bile acid pool, which allows for a taxa shift in the small intestine, where you get more gram-negative bacteria. When you have more gram-negative bacteria, what that means is you've got more LPS in the small intestine. And then the small intestine becomes leaky because there's all of this inflammation going on. That LPS then migrates past the intestinal epithelium into the basolateral circulation, then into the liver, and causes more liver damage. So it's a self-perpetuating loop. That more liver damage then further increases the growth of gram-negative bacteria and further decreases the amount of bile that's being produced. So the gram-negative bacteria continuously release LPS, allows LPS to go in, further damaging the liver, which then further reduces the amount of bile. So it's a self-perpetuating loop. In fact, here's one study that looked at 372 high-risk patients that had symptoms of, that had risk for non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. They found that 141 of them, about 38% of these people tested positive for SIBO, so they are called a study group, and 231 of them tested negative control for SIBO. This is in a high-risk group. And then they started looking at, in both of these groups, how often the non-alcoholic fatty liver disease show up, and they found that in the SIBO group, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease occurred in 45.4%, compared to only 17% in the non-SIBO group. So SIBO and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease go hand in hand, right? And of course, in these SIBO patients, all of the liver enzymes are elevated. Type 2 diabetes is elevated, but remember the diabetes connection earlier when I talked about the enterococcus connection orally and how diabetics actually tend to have more SIBO. The oral bacteria that tend to be prevalent in diabetic small intestine also are the bacteria that are prevalent in SIBO. It all starts to connect together. Of course, hypertension, part of that driven by the presence of LPS in the circulatory system. That presence of LPS triggers the renin-angiotensin system because it causes inflammation in the vascular system. That inflammation triggers that renin-angiotensin system, which decreases the compliance. That goes back to what we originally talked about with COVID-19 and all of those risk factors. So it all ties together with the same chronic inflammatory dysbiosis, leaky gut scenario. But liver dysfunction is a very prevailing issue with this. And there's lots of studies on NASH and NAFLD and SIBO. This is where they've done a lot of work on characterizing SIBO bacteria and so on. So we've got dysfunction in stomach acid that seems to be clearly correlated with SIBO. We've got dysfunction in bile that also seems clearly correlated with SIBO. Then we have the issue of stasis, which is well known to be an issue in SIBO. We've got the peristalsis and the migrating motor complex that is supposed to protect against things being allowed to ruminate in the small intestine. We need things to not stay in the small intestine for a long time. Things need to move on down into the large intestine where they can ferment, and that system is designed to handle the fermentation. If that fermentation occurs in the small intestine, we get all types of symptomology. So we've got things that compromise peristalsis and the migrating motor complex, things like gastroparesis, which is important to note, celiac disease, so any sort of enteropathy or inflammatory process going on in the intestinal epithelium negates the peristaltic activity in the migrating motor complex. Any sort of enteropathy outside of celiac disease like HIV enteropathy or food sensitivities that cause the inflammation enteropathy. Of course, low stomach acid is another thing, and then of course LPS as well. So I started digging into the role of LPS in negating the migrating motor complex in peristalsis, because one of the things we know about LPS is it disrupts the gut-brain communication. Because LPS, when it's allowed to leak through, enters the enteric nervous system, and then through the enteric nervous system ends up in the brain and the brainstem, right? So I started digging into studies, and sure enough, we find that there's a lot of correlation between SIBO and the presence of LPS. Here's a really interesting study that looked at pediatric small intestinal bacterial overgrowth in low-income countries. Low-income countries where there's a lot of oral fecal contamination going on in the water and the food supply and so on, in the environment in general, because of either open sewage systems and contaminated water and so on, you tend to find really high levels of SIBO, especially in pediatric cases, right? And they concluded from studying these communities and studying these patients that it is their hypothesis that the mechanism of SIBO development in the setting of unsanitary living condition stems from repeated exposure to abnormal levels of LPS via contaminated soil, drinking water, which then abrogates the migrating motor complex, leading to luminal stasis. So higher amounts of LPS leads to luminal stasis. That is really an interesting concept, because what is happening in the SIBO small intestine? You're getting a taxa shift to gram-negative bacteria. When you get a taxa shift to gram-negative bacteria, you also have higher and higher levels of LPS being produced in the small intestine. When you have higher and higher levels of LPS being produced in the small intestine, you have more LPS translocating into the circulatory system, which then seems to be able to abrogate the migrating motor complex. So I dug into this further, and sure enough, there are more studies that show that in animal models, E. coli-derived LPS has been shown to both decrease the frequency and the strength of the small intestinal contractions and eliminate the migrating motor complex. So it is compromising the peristaltic activity, so it's slowing down gastric passage through the small intestine, allowing for more time for putrefaction, and it's also eliminating the migrating motor complex, which is really important in cleaning up the small intestine. Right, so LPS is doing this, and further studies show the mechanism by which they do this. This is also an animal-based study, because you can't do this in humans. But what they did is they took animals and they injected them with LPS. Right, when they injected them with LPS, they noted an induction of TNF alpha, which is a pro-inflammatory cytokine. That's one of the main inducing cytokines that LPS triggers when it's present in tissue. And what they found was that TNF alpha stopped gastric motility within 60 minutes of injecting the LPS. And it was not possible to elicit gastric motility using a prokinetic or a gastrokinetic stimulant. In the treatment of SIBO, we're often using prokinetics to try to help the bowel get moving. But this shows if LPS is in circulation, it's going to stop gastric motility within an hour of the presence of LPS, and you cannot reignite the LPS you cannot reignite motility by using prokinetics, right? And what they found the mechanism is, they showed the LPS actually enters a part of the brainstem called the dorsal vagal complex, where it abrogates the centralized motility signals coming from the brain by activating TNF alpha and other inflammatory cascades in the brainstem, right? So think about LPS after a meal. We showed in our studies that in 55% of healthy normals, you got a 6 to 7-fold increase in circulating LPS after a meal, especially a high-fat, high-caloric meal. And what happens is that LPS, once it enters, within an hour of entering, can completely shut down the centralized signals from the brain to the small intestine for peristalsis and for the migrating motor complex. And you cannot re-trigger it with prokinetics. So it's dead. The signals from the brain to the intestine are completely dead. Same researchers did a follow-up study, and they showed when they administered anti-TNF alpha compounds, meaning they're stopping the inflammatory cascade that LPS started, they were able to reinvigorate the motility. They were able to reverse the motility aberration that was occurring due to LPS. So they could stimulate, if they could, would stimulate it, so they were showing that they would put in the systemic LPS, it stimulated the endogenous TNF alpha production, but using an anti-TNF alpha compound, they were able to restore the central tyrotrophin releasing hormone, increasing motility. So this proved that the mechanism for creating the stasis was through LPS and through its triggering of the inflammatory cascade in the dorsal vagal complex. Right? So think about this as we're putting it all together now. We've got dysfunction in stomach acid, which is very common. I think some, and whether it's through H. pylori infection or PPI use, or likely both of them are extremely common in our society. H. pylori is said to infect somewhere around 25 to 30% of people in our society where they have overgrowth of H. pylori. PPIs are, of course, some of the most common OTCs used. So between those two alone, we've got a significant number of people with dysfunction in gastric secretions. That in itself is allowing the bacteria in the mouth to migrate through the stomach acid and get into the small intestine. Now, once it gets into the small intestine, we've got all of this bile dysfunction because we've got liver toxicity going on. Non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is becoming an epidemic in our country. So we've got bile disruption that is there in place to protect us from those bacteria overgrowing, and the liver is not necessarily being addressed in SIBO. And then on top of that, we've got the stasis issue, and the stasis is being driven by LPS endotoxemia. And LPS endotoxemia increases as SIBO gets worse, because SIBO is characterized by a taxa shift to gram-negative bacteria, which are the type of bacteria that produce and have LPS. So it's a self-perpetuating system that continues to get worse if we don't address the core problems here. And we'll kind of conclude all of that together. How common is this LPS endotoxemia? I said when we did this study and we saw this dramatic increase in LPS postprandially, we found that to be present in 55% of healthy normal individuals that we tested and screened. 55%. And here's the crazy thing: it's increased fat intake actually makes this problem worse, and increased protein intake will make the problem worse as well, because one of the side effects of digesting protein is you produce more ammonia in the gut. And when you produce more ammonia, then the issue is the pH goes up higher. And with the higher pH, you get more of these bacteria surviving through. All of the oral microbes do much better in a higher pH. And then with the increased fat intake, you get more endotoxemia. So you get more LPS going in, shutting off the signal of the peristaltic signal and the migrating motor complex of the dorsal vagal complex. And typically when people are experiencing SIBO, they're going away from carbohydrates, they're going away from fermentable carbohydrates in particular, and they're actually eating more fat and protein, because that gives less of the bloating symptomology, right? But that kind of dietary shift is actually making the root cause problems worse. So here's how we think about comprehensive SIBO treatment, right? And again, this is in addition to anything else that you've done that seems to help SIBO patients. But I want you guys to think about this in a different way. In addition to targeting the overgrowth itself with antibiotics or antimicrobials, to me, it's extremely important to address the underlying issues of stasis, right? Which involves LPS-mediated systemic TNF-alpha upregulation and aberration at the central motility signals, which is in the dorsal vagal complex. Right? So if we don't address that, then the motility issues are never going to get repaired. Because remember, even with adding in prokinetics, you are not able to turn on the motility because the signal was lost right at the brainstem itself, right? The gut and the brain are not communicating. So a very important part of SIBO would be addressing the LPS endotoxemia. And again, prokinetics won't work if the DVC is compromised. So to stop it, we have to deal with the endotoxemia itself. Low HCl and gastroparesis must be addressed, right? And that can be addressed in a few different ways. We'll talk about it in the next slide. Liver support is critical because not only is the liver implicated in reduced bile production, but as endotoxemia and the taxa shift to gram-negative bacteria increases, the liver becomes more and more compromised, in fact, leading all the way to non-alcoholic fatty liver disease and NASH. So liver support is critical in SIBO because liver dysfunction goes hand in hand with SIBO. And just think about it. I mean, the vast majority of practitioners I've talked to are not really addressing liver dysfunctions when it comes to SIBO. And to reduce the risk of comorbidities, mucosal damage and mucosal inflammation has to be addressed because one of the features of SIBO is it's driving leaky gut. And we all know that leaky gut drives all other kinds of conditions. So yes, you have the bloating, you have the distension of the bowel, and that's a really uncomfortable and really embarrassing problem to have. But beyond that, that symptom is also part of a bigger picture that's driving all kinds of chronic inflammation that makes you susceptible to other chronic illnesses, including the pandemic that's going on right now. Colonic saccharolytic bacteria have to be supported to prevent further pathology because you need things like butyrate, you need things like short-chain fatty acids, which are going to help repair the enteropathy that's happening in the small and then subsequently in the large intestine as well. And SIBO people are not getting these fermentable carbohydrates because they have to stay away from them. So there may be some techniques to think about that as well. So here's how we recommend SIBO support, right? First, if you're using antibiotics or antimicrobials, natural antimicrobials, you also need to support the native bacteria because even if it's a natural antimicrobial, it's going to kill some of the good bacteria as it's killing the bad bacteria, right? So we need to minimize opportunistic and aberrant growth in the intestine. Using the spore-based probiotic for this fits completely well using something like Saccharomyces boulardii, which has been shown in antibiotic studies to reduce the overgrowth of dysfunctional bacteria during the course of antibiotics. So this combination of spore-based probiotics and Saccharomyces boulardii can be quite powerful and quite important in SIBO itself. And then, of course, the spore-based probiotics deals with the LPS translocation. That's one of the most important functions of the spore-based probiotic. The other thing that can help with the LPS translocation is the use of immunoglobulins. So high concentration IgG, because the IgG actually binds the LPS in the small intestinal lumen itself, right? So we reduce the amount of LPS that has the opportunity to translocate and then cause that stasis that's seen in SIBO. We also might have to address oral health, right? So a lot of the dysbiotic flora is probably coming from the mouth. And there may be a correlation between poor oral health and the presence of SIBO. So addressing oral health may be important as well. Companies like Biobotanical have oral rinses and toothpaste and things like that that may address this oral health issue, but that's something to think about for your patients as well. And then HCl and ox bile can be really important because remember, stomach acid and bile are the natural protective mechanisms against small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. And it's clear that there's typically a compromise in both HCl and bile or one of the two during the course of SIBO development. So using supplemental HCl, using ox bile as a supplement may be extremely effective and important in kind of a comprehensive addressing of SIBO. We also wanted to create more tools, so we looked at a few other things. One is artichoke leaf extract. This is actually a prescription drug in Spain and in Germany, and we started using it here in the US with some really great success in SIBO people. It stimulates bile production. So bile flow, gallbladder dysfunction starts to become a very prevailing component of SIBO. If you use this artichoke leaf extract, you actually start to see a stimulation of bile production, balancing of cholesterol levels because the liver is seeing less toxicity through this process, and we also start to see a better movement of the bowel in itself. We also started working with this licorice flavonoid that seems to protect the gastric mucosa itself and balance H. pylori levels. Now, we don't want to necessarily kill off H. pylori with the use of antibiotics, because there are studies that show that when you kill off H. pylori completely, it increases the risk of other things like gastroesophageal cancers. H. pylori is supposed to be controlled at or below 10 to the 3 CFUs in the stomach. So if you can bring it to that level or below, then you get the function of H. pylori without the risks of having overgrowth. That's one of the things that this particular ingredient has demonstrated in a couple of different clinical trials, showing that you can balance H. pylori, which tends to be a prominent feature of SIBO. And then finally, you need to increase gastric emptying time and soothe the dysfunction, the nausea, and the bloating and all that occurs with SIBO. And we found that a 20% ginger root extract seems to do that quite well. So this combination becomes a really important SIBO type of combination to deal with some of the underlying issues found in SIBO, right? So this is just another comprehensive way to go after what we believe to be some of the root causes of SIBO. I think a lot of focus has been put on just trying to control the overgrowth by antimicrobials and antibiotics. That can help, certainly, and that may be a first-line defense, but you can't just do that. You have to do that in addition to addressing the underlying issues of bile dysfunction, HCl issues, gastric emptying time, gallbladder functions, liver health, the peristaltic issue, the stopping of the migrating motor complex of the peristalsis, so the endotoxemia that seems to be present. So all of those things together have to be addressed. So all of those conditions, to me, are a bigger issue, and SIBO ends up being a symptom of it, right? SIBO ends up being a symptom of a systemic alteration in HCl function, in liver function, in bile production, and bile flow. Those things are very common because they're driven by very common behaviors, and then SIBO ends up being part of the symptomology. And then when SIBO is established, you get even more leaky gut, even more LPS, which drives all of the problems over and over again, right? It's a self-perpetuating system, but it's a much more complex issue than just overgrowing small intestinal bacteria.